Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I don't even have to say it three times because you're so quiet, but I'm so happy to see you all. And I'm just, Schemel's back again. So it's with great enthusiasm that I welcome you to the first almost normal Schemel luncheon seminar in a long time. These last years have been kind of under a cloud. We have had the pandemic, which continues, though we are far better at handling it. And we have the results of Trumpism, which persists, and we are trying to deal with that. Well, our speaker today will certainly confirm just who is living in the White House now. She knew who was living there before. Ashley Parker is the White House bureau chief of the Washington Post. After covering 4 years of the Trump administration, she's now covering a very different resident of the White House. The job is surely one of the most important journalistic positions in the country, as we citizens have the right as well as the responsibility to know what the elected officials of our nation are thinking about and acting on. Of course, the leaders want to hear from us too. So it is important that we be able to speak with knowledge about the state of affairs in our nation. And it is our job to do so. And that is why I am so pleased to welcome and honored to have Ashley Parker begin the Schemel Forum fall semester.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction, Sandra. I was so excited when I was invited here because I have some longstanding ties to Scranton, which is mainly that half of my family is here or is from here. My dad, Bruce Parker, was born and raised here. My uncle Phil, his older brother, graduated from the University of Scranton. My grandfather, Jerry Parker, Maury told me last night he was a council member, but I knew he was a failed mayoral candidate because we have some Parker for mayor buttons still in my parents' basement floating around. My cousin David Soffinelli is here. My cousin Sarah Soffinelli may or may not be watching on a live stream. Hi, Sarah. Justine has lots of fun hanging out with you. Their mom, Natalie Gelb, I think a lot of you may know her. She informed me this morning that she emailed half of you to come, so I apologize if you were dragged here against your will. And her brother, Michael Gelb, was also born here. She's not here because he's undergoing surgery today, so I'm thinking of them. And also, actually, during COVID, my family caved, and we bought a very short-lived subscription to Ancestry.com to kind of keep us busy. And I found out there was, I don't know if it was like a great-grandfather who, but there was a Parker delicatessen that went out of business. But so I feel like a strong connection to the area. And I have also been back here, ironically, not with President Biden, but I came a couple times with former President Trump during the 2016 campaign, where he also had very fervent crowds in Wilkes-Barre. It was some of the kind of most enthusiastic crowds for Trump I had seen when I was covering him on the campaign trail. And I sort of like would look around these gyms and wonder if a third cousin was heckling me from above. So anyhow, I'm going to mainly make this hopefully a Q&A because that may be more interesting to you guys, but I'll just tell you a little bit about my career and covering the White House and then throw it open to questions. So basically, I graduated from college, and my first job, I was a researcher for Maureen Dowd. She's a New York Times columnist. She's an amazing boss, amazing mentor. I worked for her for 5 years. If there were any students here, I would say 5 years is too long to be an assistant, no matter how wonderful your boss is, but it was a wonderful experience. And then from there, I got hired by the New York Times as a reporter. So I moved to New York. I was a general assignment reporter on the Metro desk. Then I covered Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. So I traveled all around the country with Mitt Romney, basically living in hotels every night. I think my husband and I, he's also a political journalist. He works for the New York Times and covers Republicans and Trump. But for our honeymoon, we went to Japan and we stayed only in Ritz's, only on Marriott points. And we still have like 2 million collective Marriott points. So it's it's a very nice perk. My husband actually liked at each new Ritz, he would tell them that this was our second Ritz or this was our third Ritz, and I thought it was so obnoxious. But he was just very excited, and it's a nice perk of living out of a suitcase. Then so I covered Mitt Romney. Then I moved to D.C. and I covered Congress for 2.5 years or so. And then I kind of covered the Tea Party wave in Congress. This was like 2013, 2014. And then I knew I wanted to cover another campaign because I felt like when I had covered Romney, I was young, I was learning things on the fly. And I kind of felt by like October of 2012, I had figured it all out, right? And I was very well positioned to be a very well sourced White House reporter for a Romney administration. So I wanted to do it over and bring all those lessons to bear in 2016. So the New York Times, they first sent me out on poor, sad, sweet Jeb Bush. I covered kind of the last gasps of a once great political dynasty. And then 2 days later, they put me on Trump, which of course was like no presidential campaign I or anyone had ever seen. And all of those hard fought lessons I learned with Romney, like did not apply to the Trump template in any way, shape, or form. So I covered Trump for the New York Times. When Trump won, I moved to the Washington Post. So I've been at the Post for about 6 years. In the process, I started appearing on MSNBC, which was fun. I had the opportunity, I had a baby. I had in the second year of the Trump White House, which was kind of crazy. I had the opportunity to co-moderate a Democratic primary presidential debate, which was something I kind of never expected. And that's basically my career. So I feel like one of the best ways to kind of understand, because a lot of people are curious about what about the differences between the Times and the Post. But a lot of people are also curious of what are the differences between covering President Trump and covering President Biden. And when I came on the White House beat under President Biden, I sort of think under Trump rather, the best way to understand it was we kind of had two rotations. And one was called the duty rotation, and one was called the hot seat rotation. And the duty rotation was sort of a traditional White House rotation. It meant when it was your week, it was a very elaborate color-coded system in an Excel spreadsheet that I'm now responsible for making. But it basically meant when you were on duty, you did all the things that a traditional White House reporter does. You would go to the briefing room, sit in the chair, ask questions at the briefing. If the president had an event in Scranton or was traveling to the UN in New York or, doing something out in Ohio, you had to go. If you had a seat on Air Force One, if the Post had a seat on Air Force One, it's a rotation. You would fly on Air Force One with the president. If you didn't, the Post is one of the only news organizations that we staff the president wherever he or she goes. So, so you would fly, so everyone else would fly on Air Force One and you would fly to Toledo unilaterally. And that was kind of your week. With Biden, if he spends most of his weekends in Wilmington, you go to Wilmington with him. With Trump, you would go down to Mar-a-Lago or you would go to Bedminster and you would kind of write the day story, right? Biden selling the Infrastructure Reduction Act, or Biden is, doing campaigning in Pennsylvania. He's in Pittsburgh on Labor Day. You would write that story. So that was one rotation. The second rotation we called the hot seat, and it felt a little bit uniquely formulated for President Trump. And it was basically to deal with the incoming fire hose of news because, unlike with President Biden, not that he always stays on message and presidents have to adjust and there's crises they don't expect, but in general, if Biden sets out to sell infrastructure one week, that's what he's going to do. You may recall that under Trump, there was this running joke of infrastructure week, right? Infrastructure week meant firing his Secretary of State by tweet week, or infrastructure week meant, accidentally blowing up Article 5 with NATO. And so the hot seat person would basically, it was everyone's least favorite job on the post-White House team. When I was hot seat, I would, and this changed after I had a kid and was kind of just like awake at all hours, but previously I was not a morning person, so I would set my alarm when I was hot seat for 6 a.m., 6:15, 6:30, and 7. Basically, my alarm would go off, like reach over, I'd grab my phone, I would look to see if Trump had tweeted, and if he hadn't, I would hit snooze and I'd go back to sleep. And then repeat it at 6:15 or 6:30, and normally around like 6:37, there would be a tweet from the president. It would often be quite newsy, and I would just pull my laptop into bed and start filing. And we still have that system with President Biden, but obviously the demands are different. President Biden is often not making news via tweet at 6 a.m. So it sort of functions as more of a backup. If I'm, getting back from being with Biden in Pittsburgh on Labor Day and I can't get back in time for the briefing, the hot seat person takes the briefing for me. But that's kind of like the one fundamental difference as a way of understanding Trump versus Biden. And I think there was a misconception of what it was like to be a reporter covering Trump. I think some people thought it was just like 1-800 dial a leak, right? And we just sat at our desks being like, hello, tell me your secrets. And that's not actually what it was like at all. It was still very daunting. We had to call sources. Sort of the reporting in many ways doesn't change at all. But a difference was that under President Trump, former President Trump, there were different factions in different rivalries. And they understood that their boss, Trump, was most receptive or was often most receptive to things he saw on television or he read in the paper. So sometimes you would wonder to sources, right? You're a senior White House aide. If you feel so strongly about this position on trade or this position on immigration, why don't you just walk into the Oval Office and present your memo to the president? But they felt that they were likely to be far more effective if Trump saw it on Fox News or on Morning Joe on MSNBC or read it in the Washington Post or the New York Times. So they sort of tried to use us in certain ways to push their agenda. And there were also all of these rival factions who were always trying to knife each other. And, there was like the Jared faction and the Steve Bannon nationalist faction and the traditional Republican Reince Priebus faction. And they were also warring out in the media because that's how Trump liked to see them battle in the media. It's not to say that other White Houses don't have battles or infighting, but they might happen in more traditional ways, right? Like a debate in the Oval Office or in the Situation Room. And so if you are a close reader of the Washington Post, which I hope you all are, you may notice that in some of our stories about Trump, there's often a line that says, this portrait of former President Trump in this moment when Mar-a-Lago was raided is the result of interviews with 27 senior White House officials, Republican lawmakers, confidants, outside advisors, blah, blah, blah. There's a couple of reasons why we do that. One is it makes the writing a little smoother because then you can just kind of tell the story. Two is we think it's important to tell readers, look, this isn't just, again, taking transcription from one person with an agenda or a vendetta or someone who doesn't like Jared or someone who's frustrated with the president. But really it's because that we found that to actually do our jobs, which is to fairly and accurately and thoroughly and rigorously bring you the information and the truth as we best understand it in that moment, you had to talk to 27 people. Because my understanding, again, Trump was the first White House I covered full time as a White House reporter. I wrote bits and pieces about Obama. But my understanding was that in previous administrations, there were certain people who, if in George W. Bush, if Karl Rove or Karen Hughes told you something, you'd of course, you'd fact check it, you'd confirm it, you'd run it down, but you could kind of trust it to be true. Same in the Obama administration. If David Axelrod or Valerie Jarrett told you something, you probably assumed you check it, you confirm it, but you'd assume it was accurate. But we sort of realized that in covering former President Trump, that to really understand what had happened in a meeting, you had to talk to all 6 people who were in the meeting. You had to talk to all 13 people who those people had talked to. You then had to talk to the 22 people who those people had talked to, and you had to balance it all against what you knew about their competing agendas and their rivalries, and also how honest or dishonest they were. And so there were some sources in the Trump White House who were incredibly honest and incredibly helpful behind the scenes. I'm not going to name them and so embarrass them, but there were people who I just believe never lied to me and were very helpful with saying, this is true, that's not true, let me add some nuance and context, right? So there were those people. There were the people who I thought of kind of as Wikipedia. So they were a really good jumping off point, but you would never alone cite that in a term paper. But, oh, like this is an interesting start. Let me run it down. And then there were sources I kind of thought of as Reddit. So you're kind of going down a rabbit hole. There's a lot of conspiracy theories, but, maybe something interesting or true, a good tip pops up that's worth chasing. So that was kind of how we covered former President Trump. I think another thing that would surprise, and I'll get to dishonesty in a second, but I think something else that might surprise people, I mean, it sounds like your politics, most of you are Democrats, I'm assuming. Maybe not everyone, but. So I think, so I think one thing that might surprise people is if you met Trump in person, even if you were deeply prepared not to like him or to be very skeptical, that when he wants to be, he can be incredibly charming and incredibly charismatic. And he's a consummate salesman and a consummate sort of host, right? He owns Bedminster, he owns Mar-a-Lago, he owns these private clubs. So I would be on Air Force One with Trump, and he would come back on the plane, which a lot of presidents don't do, or they come back very infrequently. He would come back very frequently. And when he would come back, it wasn't like, depending on his mood, but it wasn't like he was the president. It was like and it wasn't like it was the government's Boeing 747, it was like it was his private Trump Force Air, and he wanted to make sure you were having a good time, right? So he'd come back, and is everybody okay? Are they taking care of you? Like, Ashley, you need another Diet Coke. And you sort of felt like if you said, oh, yes, I'm parched, that President Trump would go and get you a Diet Coke. And he sort of has that side to him, and I think people initially were often confused in some ways that he was would often shift on policies. But one helpful way to understand him is that he is, as some of his aides had said to me, is he's someone who is sort of always trying to win over the person directly in front of him. And he's trying to get through the minute, the hour, the day, and win. So he would do certain things. And, my editors initially would be like, is this like a Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell 4D chess move, right? He did this, which makes no sense, because then he's going to do that, which will also make no sense. And then finally, he's going to do this really brilliant thing. And it's like, no. What he's doing is he's, again, trying to win the minute, the hour, and the day. So that can explain sometimes how he would take two diametrically opposed policy positions in the course of a 24-hour period. So after the shooting in Parkland, for instance, the students come up, the survivors come up, and they visit the Oval Office. It's incredibly moving, of course. He's moved. He's also trying to win them over. So, of course, he says, yes, I'm for reasonable gun control, and background checks seem totally legitimate. And why should we have assault rifles on the streets, right? Because that's sort of what he believes in that moment. And that's what he believes that group of people in front of him wants to hear. And so they come out, we're going to get a deal. We're going to get, guns done. And then, 4 hours later, the NRA lobbyist comes in. And now he's trying to win over the lobbyist for the NRA. And what that person wants to hear is quite different. So he says, of course, we're not going to take your guns away, right? Like, of course, one tragedy in Florida doesn't mean that we upend the Second Amendment. And so everyone's quite confused, right? Because these things are diametrically at odds with one another. But again, if you just understand he's trying to win over whoever is in front of him, it at least explains where those changing positions are coming from. And the interesting thing there is that whenever there was that tension, you saw it on guns, you saw it sometimes on immigration, whenever there was that tension, ultimately, at the end of the day, for as long as I have covered him, he would always retreat back to where his far-right conservative base was. At the end of the day, as much as he is a leader of that movement and can get his supporters to understand campaign slogans and parrot them back faster than any politician I've ever seen in history, he was sort of afraid of crossing them. So he would always go back to that far right base. But kind of speaking of Air Force One, I also think Trump was much more accessible than past presidents and the current president. So Trump, again, used to come back on Air Force One probably a third of the rides to talk to the reporters. He'd talk to us off the record. He'd talk to us on the record. He'd talk to us off the record. And then when he was walking away, he'd say, actually, that's all on the record. And Biden in the 18 months or so that he's been president, he only came back on Air Force One once the entire time. And again, that's far more common. Obama didn't come back a ton. I don't think George W. Bush, Clinton, HW came back a ton. But you did have a lot of access to Trump and kind of knew what he was thinking in that exact moment. And with Trump even, one time I was on the plane, it was a swing out west, and not only did so it was during the Democratic primaries, it was sort of right before COVID happened. It was a 3-day swing out west. And normally Trump likes to sleep in his own bed. So he always, wherever you flew to, you would fly back to DC. So it led to these long days. But we're on the West Coast, so he could stay in Vegas. He could stay in the Trump properties in Vegas. So he had a rally, but there was a Democratic debate going on that night. This was in the moment of these Democratic debates were very exciting. And so he comes back to talk to the press, and he says, did you guys watch the debate? And we're like, no, we're at your rally, right? Like, and he's like, me either, but like I TiVoed it, and we're like, oh, can we come watch it with you? And he's like, yeah, come on up. So he leads us through Air Force One, right? Like every single staff member, every single Secret Service agent is horrified. And he brings us up to the front cabin. And he also, because he's the consummate host, as he's walking up to the cabin, he's saying to the Air Force One staff, can you bring them some shrimp cocktail and some tiny meatballs? And he sort of didn't understand that the food gets loaded on Air Force One. It's planned weeks in advance, and it gets loaded on that afternoon. And they had no idea he was going to host a party with the press in the front cabin. So no meatballs and no shrimp cocktail are forthcoming. And he's very frustrated. And he's asking everyone, his official photographer. And finally, they get some very nice Air Force One napkins, and they put potato chips in them. But he brings us up, and he's TiVoed the debate, and he turns on the Democratic debate, which we all wanted to see. And we watched the Democratic debate with Donald Trump, who does very astute color commentary, right? He's very spot on. He was like, oh man, Elizabeth Warren, she's mean, but she's taking Michael Bloomberg down. That's a good hit. That's going to stick in voters' minds. And he's spot on. So it's just a totally different experience than President Biden, who's been back once and didn't seem to particularly enjoy that experience. And the other thing that I think is interesting is obviously Trump's reputation for dishonesty at this point precedes him. And he said things all the time that were not true. So did his aides. It's a hallmark of the administration that he's still not accepting the results of a free and fair election. But I do think there's a sort of misconception that Democratic administrations or non-Trump administrations don't lie, because they do as well. I can give you one example. I mean, they may be less blatant, and it's sometimes sort of very nuanced spin that's too cute by half. But just one of many examples that comes to mind of the current president is we're working on a story. I won't name the official, but we go to the White House and we say, and we heard that official X was in this meeting. And we plan to report this. So the press person we talked to, they check with official X, and they come back to us and they say, official X was not in this meeting, right? And the fact that you would come to us and say that official X is in this meeting when official X was not in this meeting means that your sources are horrible. You need to double check your sources. You need to double check everything in that article. How are you trusting these people? So that's weird, because we really felt confident official X was in that meeting, but we'll go back, we'll re-report this. So we re-report it, and we find out that official X was not physically in the meeting, but that official X called in via Zoom, which based on my definition means that they were in the meeting and they were participating in the meeting. And so again, it's a little more nuanced, but every administration, Democratic, Republican, pre-Trump, Trump, certainly post-Trump, has their own way of spinning and misleading the press when it suits their purposes. And then Biden, of course, is a much more traditional candidate, much more traditional president. His staff is very insular. He has about half a dozen mainly white guys, mainly older white guys, who have been with him for decades, many of since he was, worked for him on the Senate Judiciary Committee. and they're sort of his core group of people. You can argue that's good or bad. He obviously instills tremendous loyalty in the people who have worked for him and the people he's known for a while. It can also be insular and frustrating for people who want to come in and think they have fresh ideas. And even sort of these people, who you'll talk to them and they have worked for Biden or been in his orbit for 12 years and they're like the newbie, right? Like he's just getting comfortable with them. So it's just a very different dynamic where in certain ways, everyone with Trump was new because he'd never run for anything before, right? He woke up, he wanted to run for something, he ran for president, he won. He didn't really know anyone. Unlike Biden, he didn't have years of being the Senate Judiciary Committee or a, councilman from Delaware or a vice president and having all of that staff and infrastructure. So kind of everyone in Trump's world in a lot of ways were either political novices or people who had been in politics for a while, but who he didn't really trust. Whereas Biden, it's quite the opposite. And then Biden had a theory of the case and a theory of government in a way that Trump did not really. Trump has certain he's shifted on a lot of policies. He sort of has a couple gut instincts, which if you go back and look at statements from years ago in his books, he's always been pretty hardline on immigration. He's always sort of been a reluctant free trader. But beyond that, he didn't really have a theory of the case, whereas Biden had a very clear theory of the case and a very clear theory of why he was running, which he articulated from the day he announced on, which was to restore and save the soul of the nation. And he presented himself as steady, stable, serious, competent leadership. Kind of the anti-Trump is how he was casting himself. And I do think that's why what happened with the Afghanistan withdrawal was so damaging for him. It was, first of all, that also goes to his theory of the case. The way someone described it to me was, Biden, when he was Obama's VP, he sat 2 inches to the right of Obama in the Situation Room, and he knew what he would do on Afghanistan. He didn't get to do it because he was the vice president. He was very loyal. He was very deferential, but he heard the cases made. He saw the facts on the ground, and he knew that this was a war that he believed U.S. men and women should not be fighting and we should be out of. So he comes into office, and it wasn't that he was reckless. He sort of did the meetings and the reports and the full 360 of decision making and the interagency process, but he came in knowing that he was going to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. That was something he felt in his bones. And so again, the reason I think the withdrawal hurt him so much politically was because those chaotic images that week in August that we all saw of desperate Afghans, overrunning the airport in Kabul, clinging, to the wings and the wheel wells of planes. Those reports that, a plane lands in Qatar and a dead body is found in the wheel well, or a young Afghan soccer player hanging onto the wing falls to his death. That did not give the sense of steady, calm, stable leadership and this promise that a lot of voters were ready for post-Trump, which is you don't have to constantly check the news, and you don't have to wake up every morning and wonder what new crisis is awaiting you, and you don't have to come down to the breakfast table and explain to your 12-year-old daughter, what word the president of the United States just used, right? Like leave the governing to me and I can handle it. And the administration, their talking point, which may have been true, was there's no way to leave a losing war after 2 decades. Most Americans don't like this war. People agree with the policy, and in 2 months they're going to forget all about it. But what it was again, it eroded that sort of core competency that Biden had, and you can look. That's when he begins going down in the polls in August. It's that, and it's COVID comes back. There's the Delta surge, and it goes into inflation, and then he has this quite devastating year that in the past 3 months he's kind of really pulled out of with a string of victories. But it does sort of start in Afghanistan. And I was talking to a Democratic operative who tracks polling very closely, and they basically said Biden in that 1 week and then of course there was the suicide bombing that killed 13 American servicemen and women, but they said in that 1 week, of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, basically Biden dropped in approval ratings, the number of approval ratings it would normally take 5 months to drop, and kind of never recovered, and then continued dropping from there in like small, more manageable ways. And I don't know. I guess that's mainly it. I'm happy. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, sure.
Ashley, I read in your paper that where he's at in approval is really where the last several presidents were at this time in their term of office. So we, Democrats, shouldn't panic right now. I see some young Democrats, I don't consider myself any more a young Democrat, saying, oh, we need to get somebody else now. But I think Joe Biden's doing fine at this point. I don't know how you feel.
I mean, I think I've been looking, I was looking at polling for something I'm writing. I do know he had sort of hit a low, like the one of the lowest. I mean, again, it depends on the poll and it depends on the moment, and you can cut polls many different ways, right? So there was something that, like, according to a Gallup poll, he was the lowest ever since I don't know if it was like World War I or what it was, in sort of like the sixth quarter of his presidency, right? Which sounds bad. I mean, I think it objectively is bad. People in the White House were not delighted to be there. But you can certainly cut that other ways, right? What if you looked at the fourth quarter of his presidency? Maybe he's just doing as bad as all presidents who generally, get a shellacking in the midterms and do quite poorly in the first year of their presidency. I mean, I do know in the White House that Biden and his aides track the approval numbers quite closely. They say they're not dictated by them, but I do know they pay attention, and it does sort of affect the mood. And if they go up a third of a percentage point, it's a great day. And if they go down, a third of a percentage point, it's cataclysmic, is how someone put it to me. And he is coming up now, right? Because gas prices are going down. There's also a correlation between his approval, inverse correlation between his approval numbers and gas prices. And Democrats are certainly, in talking to people who've been at the White House, and a ton of people were there last week for this portrait unveiling of Obama's. And they reported there was just like a certain joyfulness and levity in the room that there would not have been 3 or 4 months ago. And they really have had this very good stretch of some things that were very much outside of their control, and some things that you could argue, and they would certainly argue, is the result of planning that started back in the campaign and then the transition. So, if you kind of look at and you take the first, and they argue this is not a good thing because they believe it's horrible for women and girls everywhere. But the first thing that sort of starts to turn their political tides is the leaked Roe v. Wade, or the leaked Dobbs decision. Then there's the actual decision where the court overturns Roe v. Wade. This is something they say is horrible and they never would have wanted to happen, but politically it's incredibly galvanizing. And Biden's aides recognize that right away, that, there was this moment, and we wrote about it at the Post, where for 2 weeks Biden really, after the decision was announced, did not come out sort of as forcefully as a lot of Democrats and pro-choice women wanted, or abortion rights women wanted to see. It kind of took him 2 weeks to come out with some executive orders and speak with the forcefulness that a lot of people wanted to see. But his advisors just sort of said, like, even if you bungle this is seismic, right? This is like an earthquake that is just so much bigger than you, that will galvanize Democratic women. So that's one thing that happens. Then they got the CHIPS bill passed, which they would argue correctly they started thinking about in like January of 2021, in the very early days of the pandemic. They, of course, would have liked for it to come together sooner, but they argue that's something where, legislation is a slow process. They laid the groundwork, they work with members, they get CHIPS done, they get burn pits done, which was something that was very important to Biden, very close to his heart because of his son, Beau. He's not sure if Beau's cancer came from being exposed to burn pits, but Biden fought very hard to mention burn pits forcefully in the State of the Union. So again, the State of the Union, I think, is April or March. But 8 months later, that legislation gets through. They say they deserve credit for that. Finally, this sort of like unrequited dance with Manchin. They finally get Manchin on board for a huge climate peace, for the Inflation Reduction Act. Gas prices are now going down a bit. He has the killing of al-Zawahiri, which is just a positive moment for him. He argues it proves his theory of the case that you can take all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan and still have a muscular presence there. Critics would say it shows that if you take all troops out of Afghanistan, a wanted terrorist like Zawahiri feels comfortable reconstituting there and walking freely on a balcony. Either way, he's dead. So Biden has this kind of very successful period that make Democrats feel a lot more bullish about their prospects. And it went from thinking in May that they were going to lose, that they would lose the Senate probably and lose like 40 seats in the House, to now thinking that they could maybe keep the Senate where it is or even pick up a seat and limit seats in the House to maybe under 10 or under 12, which would be a nightmare for Kevin McCarthy, and obviously also just objectively good for Biden's agenda. So there's still some people who think it's time to find a new leader for the Democratic Party, but I think sometimes it's for reasons beyond just the poor. When you talk to them, it's for reasons beyond just the poor poll numbers, which are improving.
Ukraine today was a big day for President Biden.
Yeah, and you, I mean, and he also had, just add briefly, he also had some bad luck, right? The way he handled Ukraine was, by almost all accounts, a big geopolitical success story, right? Like the U.S. leapt into action. They helped unite the world. NATO is stronger than ever. NATO is poised to grow by 2 countries. The transatlantic alliance is stronger than ever, but it came at a moment where Americans were, but you know what else it did? It exacerbated gas prices, and it exacerbated supply chain issues. And Americans were just fundamentally not going to reward a president for the very good job he was doing in Ukraine, when at home, you know, their gas bill and their grocery bill was $100 a month more than they could afford. So it doesn't mean he didn't do positive things according to foreign policy experts on Ukraine. It just meant he wasn't getting rewarded domestically. Yeah, Maury.
Yeah. It's November of 2024. I'm walking into my voting precinct. My choice is Donald Trump versus Joe Biden.
I mean, yeah, if I was betting, that's what I would bet. Yeah. Because the one thing I think Donald Trump is far more likely, this is based on talking to people in his orbit, far more likely to, again, you never know what happens, right? It's 2.5 years away, but Donald Trump is likely to run. If he runs, he's likely to win the Republican nomination. What his people want is they want another 2016, which means another crowded Republican field. And because Trump has a ceiling, but he also has a floor that he's never going to go behind. And so if he gets that floor, and then all the other voters are divided between a Pence and a DeSantis and a Cheney, he can still emerge as the winner. And Biden, by all accounts, is telling everyone in his orbit that he's going to run, he's planning to run. And like the one thing that makes him feel even more certain about running is this idea that he believes he's the only one who can beat Donald Trump. So in a weird way, it's like this kind of inextricably bound thing that leaves you walking into the voting booth on November 2024. Yeah.
I have a question about you as a journalist. You've always worked for very reputable organizations, the Times, the Washington Post. But I look at this room, again, very educated room, came here because they want to hear this. But I worry about what the past president did to the reputation of journalism and about truth telling. Is your profession doing anything to help rebuild that reputation, or even teach people the difference between opinion and news?
Yeah, she asked about, she said, I've always worked for reputable news outlets, but she said she fears that Trump very much damaged the reputation of journalism and journalists and news outlets in general, and is curious if, sort of what we're doing to restore faith in the institution and educate people even about something as simple as the difference between news and opinion. So it's a great question. I think you're absolutely right for starters. I mean, I often sort of thought, and again, Trump is a master messenger and a master brander. And I sometimes thought if you were an alien and you arrived on this planet and you just went to a political rally or turned on the news, right, you would think there were three political parties. You would think there were, you know, the Democrats, the MAGA Republicans, and like the fake news media, right? Because he really did turn us into an opposition party against him. And I can remember, you know, so the way it works when you're covering a campaign especially is, and again, this isn't totally unique to Trump, but he just sort of did it in a muscular Trumpian, you know, exponential on steroids way. But anytime you're covering a political event, there's sort of like, the press is kind of at a certain point, you're kind of kept in a cage, like for lack of a better term. I mean, it's bike racks, but it's a certain press area. It's often in the back of the room. And every now and then I've mainly covered Republicans my entire career, with the exception of Biden. You know, a Mitt Romney will make a joke about the press, or a Ted Cruz or whatever. And that's it. But, you know, covering Trump in the 2016 campaign, his crowds were just magnitudes larger than other candidates. And instead of being in a cage in the back of the room, we were in a cage kind of in the middle of the room, surrounded by people on all sides. And I often think of Trump rallies as like a Trump show, right? So almost like a concert. So if you go to a Bon Jovi concert, you know at some point he's going to play Living on a Prayer, right? Like that's what you're coming for. And if you go to a Trump show, you know at some point he's going to ask who's going to build the wall and who's going to pay for it, and you're all going to chant Mexico. And you also know at some point he's going to call out the media in the middle of the room, and you're all going to get to chant CNN sucks, CNN sucks. And it's sort of part of the show. And sometimes it was interesting, we as reporters, we kind of, and it depended on the place and the rally and the president's mood and what was in the news and the alchemy of the room. And so sometimes everyone would chant CNN sucks. And then, you know, the people on their way out of the rallies would come up and say, you know, but they were smiling, right? And they would say, you know, no offense, ma'am, you know, like, I'm sure you're doing a great job. And it was very friendly. And then there were other moments when it felt like incredibly hostile. And the TV networks got personal security for their TV correspondents to get in and out of those rallies. I mean, I was lucky because as a print reporter, nobody knows what I look like. And I appear on MSNBC, which nobody, like, if you're a conservative, you don't hate watch MSNBC, you just don't watch it, right? So, but I remember one time at a rally in San Diego during the 2016 campaign, I'm sitting there and I worked for the New York Times then, and a story had just posted that I think was critical about the campaign, the Trump campaign, had some details in it he didn't like. And so, you know, I wrote it with my then colleague, Maggie Haberman, and he says, you know, the New York Times just posted this horrible article. Has anyone seen it? And the crowd's like, boo. And it said, you know, it's written by a woman named Haberman and a woman named Parker. And, you know, I was like, boo. And then he's like, you know, are they here? Is Haberman here? Is Parker here? And it just so happened that like a very helpful Trump staffer had written like laminated like cards this size with all of our names on them. And so I'm sitting there in the front row, you know, with my Parker card, and I just very discreetly like slip it under my laptop. And, you know, everyone's like, is she here, Parker? And I just like looked around like, yeah, is she here? And it was fine because no one knew what I looked like, but it's just a very different dynamic. And then I'll answer your question. But one other thing is next Tuesday, I'm taking the Washington Post is doing and again, this isn't totally unique to Trump. I think it's just unique to the current like moment in politics and in the country. You know, I'm doing a hazardous training course, and I'm not going to Ukraine. Actually, I very briefly volunteered to go to Ukraine, and everyone's like, no, that's like, you're being crazy. We're not going to send you. But normally you take a hazardous environment training class because you're going to a war zone and you need to learn how to cover a war zone. And now we have decided, as have a lot of other news organizations, that if you're going to be out there covering politics, right, like you need hazardous environment training. You need to know what to do if there's a shooting, what to do if there's something like January 6th, what to do if someone, Democratic or Republican or whatever, gets in your face and is heckling you with a camera. And it's just a very different dynamic of when I thought I was going to be a political reporter. And the final thing, and I know Sandra has a question as well, is that to answer your question, I think the Post and other news organizations do understand that, like, we just, in this moment of declining trust and faith in institutions, which has been accelerated by a former president who has sort of thrown gasoline and lit that on fire, we don't have the ability to say, well, we're the Washington Post and we gave this statement 3 Pinocchios, so it's not true. And I think we are trying to be more transparent about our journalism and our process and explaining, this is how we did this story. Or when we call an election, or when the Associated Press calls an election, it's not just the Associated Press from on high, magically giving a verdict, because why should anyone trust the Associated Press? We took it for years that you would. They're a non-biased organization, but they're trying to explain, here's how we do it. Here's how we count the delegates. Here's how we get the votes. Here's how we make this decision. Here's why we decided, here's why Fox News decided to call Arizona for Biden instead of Trump. And Fox News, because when they did that on election night, there was such outcry, they literally sent their sort of data and polling guy on the air to explain to the Fox viewers, right? Like, we didn't just say this magical thing because we wanted Biden to win Arizona, right? We looked at the data and we looked at the precincts, and this is how we made this decision. And so I do think there is an effort to do things like that, to be as transparent as possible, because we don't get the benefit of the doubt as the media. Maybe we shouldn't, right? We need to work to earn that trust. And even stuff as simple as, I sort of always assumed, because I grew up in journalism, if a story begins, Scranton dash, like, what that means is the reporter was on the ground in Scranton reporting it. I know that because I'm a journalist. I don't know if my mom knows that. I don't know that my mom should know that, right? And so to us on stories, we think, well, that explains that the reporter actually traveled there. They talked to voters in Scranton. But if the reader doesn't know it, like, it's all kind of meaningless. So it's also working to find ways for the reader to understand what these things mean and why we're doing what we're doing. Sadr.
Yeah. I think we have this more uninformed opinions that just keep rushing after, whether it's Afghanistan, maybe people knew that we should be out of Afghanistan, and somebody had to do it, and Biden had to, so he's done it. And it just, the reactions are rolling in. I just wonder, as from your perspective, is this like a blast of maybe somewhat uninformed?
I think
That's a soft and endearing voice. We hear the question.
Sandra had basically asked that she thinks that it feels like there's just a rolling blast of uninformed opinions coming in, and is curious if I think that's the case. I think, this is sort of very obvious, but I just think there's now so many ways, especially with like the decimation of local news. There's just so many ways, and this is like a very natural human tendency anyhow, but that you can just very actively seek out a life that only reinforces your existing worldview. And so, if you think the pull out of Afghanistan was a disaster, you can only watch television and only read articles and only go to blogs and only follow people on Facebook who share that exact view, and maybe even some conspiracy theories about why. And again, if you believe that it was this huge success and no one could have done it better than Joe Biden, and that there's no good way to leave a losing war, and Joe Biden left it in the best way possible, and he is a hero who American troops will be thanking for decades to come, you can only watch it actually would have been hard to only watch TV that said that, but you can still go read things and go on blogs and talk to people who very much share that view. And that, again, that is a challenge of the media, because we, again, like at the Washington Post and where I used to work at the New York Times, strive to write stories that are fair and thorough and unbiased, and hold power to account and inform an electorate. But I can't force you to read it, and I can't force you to believe it. Nor is that really my job, but it is important, obviously, for a functioning democracy. You're in the red.
This is a little different. I'm always curious when they come up with a story and say, we haven't been able to verify. What does that entail? And when you come onto a job, are sources given to you? Do you have to develop all your sources? That kind of
yeah.
kind of-
I wish they were given to me, although I actually will. I mean, it depends. I will, you kind of have to get sourced up on your own, but I will say, to give you an example, my colleague, Ann Guerin, she was on the White House team. She was fantastic. She covered foreign policy, and she handled a lot of the foreign policy aspects of the White House. And she, about a year ago, she just wanted a career change. She sort of felt like she had one last act, and she went to a consulting firm in DC. And so there was just no one on our White House team who knew anything in a meaningful way about foreign policy. And so there's this war in Ukraine heating up, and my editors were like, Ashley, like, you're gonna handle Ukraine. and like I was like, okay, right? I was like, I'm happy to do it, but like, you should just be aware that I have, I'm not gonna be able to give you a nuanced explanation of Donbass versus Donetsk, and so they said, like, well, no, neither can anyone else on the team. So like, someone has to figure it out. It might as well be you. So in that case, she hadn't gone to a competing organization. She's a very close friend of mine. She had very positive feelings towards the Washington Post. So I basically called her. I was like, I'm gonna buy you lunch, and like, you're just gonna tell me all of your sources, right? And I was like, you don't have to tell me like a top secret source at the NSC who wouldn't want you to, or you wouldn't want to share, but like, anything you can do to help me get up to speed to this land war that's about to break out that I know absolutely nothing about. And I mean, we literally got lunch, and she just like opened up her Rolodex and was like, here's this person, and call this person, and this person's really smart about this, and this is a good expert, but they're very hawkish, so keep that in mind, and just told me everything. So again, if you have good colleagues, and I'm lucky at the Post that I have wonderful colleagues, when you move on to a beat, you have colleagues who want to help you. We have someone who just joined the White House team, and one thing we're all trying to do is, if we have a source dinner or a source breakfast, again, assuming it's not super sensitive, is invite her along so she can meet these people as well. But it's very much up to you to get sourced yourself. And then, of course, if you have an organization with a good culture, they will help you. And the have not verified it yet. That's a really good question. I mean, in general, news organizations don't like to report things that they haven't verified. But sometimes something is just such a huge story and people are responding to it, that you can't ignore it. And so again, so for instance, the Washington Post, early on after the Mar-a-Lago raid, one of the things we broke initially was that one of the things that the FBI and the Justice Department were looking for were classified documents related to nuclear weapons. And for, I don't know exactly how long, but for a couple days or so, we were the only outlet to have reported that. But something like that, it was dominating the news. It was changing the meaning of the story, and sort of what the stakes were. And so you did see other news organizations who are trying to confirm it, but in the process, they haven't yet confirmed it. But they still have to kind of address it. You just can't pretend it's not happening. So that's why you'll sometimes see that line, as the Washington Post reported, we have not yet verified. And you also often see that in a really fast breaking story where the Wall Street Journal breaks something and we're all scrambling to catch up, but cable news immediately cuts to the Wall Street Journal scoop, right? So you'll have anchors on cable news saying, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that, Joe Biden plans to cut student debt by $20,000. We at MSNBC have not yet independently verified, but assuming this happens, what would it mean? And then, in a couple of minutes, they verify it too. But that's kind of what that means. Yeah.
I'm a Kamala Harris fan, but she sort of faded into the background recently after the election. I would assume that she's going to come to the fore again after 2022, after the election. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll confess, there's someone on our team who sort of has a sub-B of Kamala Harris. That's not me, so he would be, fortunately, the better person to answer your question. But yes, I mean, what's interesting is President Biden is very committed to Kamala Harris. He chose her. He wants her to succeed, and he wants to set her up for success. Being a vice president is inherently hard. He learned that when he was Obama's vice president. You often fade to the right. Your job is to be the number two. So you fade to the background, or in her case, she's taken on some assignments that were pretty daunting. That as did Joe Biden for Obama. But she's taken on some daunting assignments. But by all accounts, he's someone who, there's no chatter of him picking a new running mate or anything like that, which is notable because it's worth noting that when Obama was president, he and his team actually polled to see if they should drop Biden from the ticket for the second term. The answer came back no, because basically it's been described to me, you can't do it because like sort of the first thing you do once you become the party's nominee, your first moment of big judgment is choosing who your running mate is going to be. So deciding you made such a bad choice that you have to kick them off the ticket also ends up being an indictment of your judgment. But that happened. None of that is happening now. What's interesting is there are a lot of Democrats, I guess, unlike yourself, who feel uncertain that she would be the best leader of the party and best nominee if Biden were to decide to only run for one term. And there's a lot of concern around there of what it means, because she's sort of the heir apparent, right? She's the vice president. It's not that the party is going to just hand her the nomination, but it does create like a slightly more awkward dynamic for people who don't necessarily think she could win a general election. Yeah,
Can I ask you a personal question?
sure.
Those awful 4 years under Trump, did you end up with a nicer?
So I loved covering Biden, and I loved covering Trump. They were very different, obviously. It's funny, I kind of think I can't believe when Trump, so I met my husband kind of covering politics. At the time, he worked for the Wall Street Journal covering the White House. I worked for the Washington Post. Now he works for the New York Times, where I used to work. I gave birth to my daughter in 2018 in the middle of Trump's second year. And she turned 2 on election day 2020, which involved us like convincing her that everybody spends election day like with a babysitter, watching returns come in from Florida. But I kind of, I think in some ways I loved covering Trump. In some ways it feels like a fever dream. And I remember when I had my daughter, we got a nanny, a wonderful nanny. She was in a nanny share, so it's basically a nanny watching 2 kids. It's just like more social and cheaper. And it was at our house, and I remember thinking and our nanny left at 6 p.m. or 6:30. It started at 6, then moved to 6:30. But I remember thinking there's no way we'll be able to get home in time, right? Like there's just no way. And my husband and I just traded off weeks. I have a stepdaughter, I have an older daughter, and it's full joint custody. So on the weeks when my older daughter was with us, my husband would be the one to get home because we had 2 kids coming home. On the weeks when my older daughter was with her mom, I would be the one to get home, and my husband could work late and travel. And again, I just remember thinking there's no way we're going to get home. There's going to be an unattended baby, and it's going to be cataclysmic. And for a year and a half, we got home every single night by 6. I mean, I still don't really understand how it happened. And it was not until the first impeachment happened that things got very dicey, and our nanny had to start staying later. And then I recently found out that our nanny basically travels with a go bag. And she told us, which is very nice because I know she didn't want to make us feel like horrible parents. She told us it's because she commutes in from Baltimore, and she said she never knows what the weather's going to be and if she'll get stranded because of the weather. But what it really is because she never knows if we're going to call her and say, Mar-a-Lago was just raided, or the president was just impeached for a second time, and we need you to do bedtime, and we need you to stay over. And so I loved it. I did not have an ulcer, but it still confuses me how we managed to make that work, other than we have a wonderful, wonderful nanny, and all of our money goes to childcare. Yes, David.
There seemed to be during the Trump administration a lot of sparring with the press secretary and the press corps. In the everyday, once the cameras roll, was there a hostility or tension between the press corps and the press staff the White House is different than it is now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually talking to Sandra and Maury a little bit about this. Oh, sorry. Okay, so David asked that the question was, it seemed a little bit like during the Trump administration, there was a lot of sparring and back and forth between the media and the press secretary. And was that different than it is now, or what was it like when the cameras were off? And so it totally depends, but I think people would be surprised by. So things got very hostile with Sean Spicer very quickly. I think everyone saw that on TV. And even now, I'm kind of surprised that, like, if I see Sean Spicer at a party in DC or an embassy event or something, and maybe it's different with other journalists, but like, he won't look at me, he won't speak to me. So that hostility was very real. Like, whatever you saw and however angry he seemed to the media, he really was that angry, and still kind of feels that anger. Now, someone like Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she could get up there, she could spar, she could, give and take. But, behind the scenes, she was incredibly helpful. That's not to say she was leaking or being disloyal, but she was a professional, right? Like, she could get up there, she could do her job in front of the cameras, which is to represent the president you work for, and often represent them sort of in tone and style, which was aggressive. And then behind the scenes, she could understand that her job was to try to help shape stories, to look as good as possible for her boss, but to also be honest, because as a professional, she understood that if she lied to us, she would sort of lose that credibility. And the next time she told us, you can't print that, well, her word wouldn't go as far as it did when she was honest. And she was also, again, and you sort of, also to answer your question about sourcing, you bond with people and sources in kind of whatever ways you can, right? It might be you both cheer for the Cleveland Browns, or it might be you're both parents. And she was like a mother of three. So she was also very human in that way of, like, you're trying to reach her and she's calling you back and she's like, I'm so sorry. My youngest son just had like an incredibly high fever and I had to run to the emergency room with him. So that was like a much more real human relationship. And obviously Jen Psaki was, she's smart. She could get up there. She could give as good as she could take it. I think most people liked Jen Psaki, respected her for not being dishonest. But it's inherently a tense relationship and inherently a little bit of a combative relationship. But you're right, it can be very different when the cameras are off.
Let me follow up on that. Are there ever any instances where one news source goes to another news source for information or verification? For example, the Washington Post goes to the New York Times and says, hey, you have some information, can you help us out?
I wish. No, I will say all of these news organizations were very collegial and collaborative. But no, you could never do that. Like, what I do is I see a New York Times thing and I think like who would have told that reporter that, right? Like, I think it's this person, and then I'll try to call them. And when I was covering campaigns and people were kind of curious what it's like to cover a campaign, I always described it is because you're living on the road, you're covering a candidate, you're with all these people who are your professional rivals, but you're often, as a group of rivals, like more at odds with the candidate than you are with each other. So I always kind of thought of it as being on like a rolling party bus of frenemies, right? So most of the time you're trying to get Romney to do a press conference, he doesn't want to do it, and you're all aligned. But then suddenly, like, someone gets a scoop and you're all so pissed at that person because you were about to, go out for a nice dinner, and now you all have to start calling sources. So there's that sort of dynamic, but no, unfortunately, yeah.
Actually, the empty files down in Florida, how significant is that? And does it scare you as much as it scares us?
I certainly think what it does, it's certainly significant, and what it does is it just raises more questions, right? Because we don't really know now why they're empty. There's a world in which the packing was, these are all just hypotheticals, right? But we just don't know. And that seems to be what has alarmed the people in the Biden administration who are doing the kind of like intelligence damage assessment. Because, is there a world in which the files were empty when they were brought to Mar-a-Lago because Trump had decided he wasn't leaving office and packing was very chaotic and someone just swept up everything on his desk in there and it's a bunch of empty files? Sure. Is it possible that the files are empty because he knew that the Justice Department wanted information back, and so he further hid the files and brought them up to Bedminster? Just nobody knows, and that seems to be the thing that, according to the experts doing the damage assessment, is so concerning. So,
In all these investigations, you feel Trump wouldn't charge you any charges? Maybe make him ineligible to be reelected?
Someone was asking me that the other day. I mean, so I will say I've not been reporting on this as much firsthand, just because I cover Biden, so I don't have as much sort of like firsthand visibility. But if I were betting, I feel like it is less likely that he is charged or convicted in a way that prevents him from running for president. But again, there's a ton of investigations, so yeah. Oh yeah.
Would you be willing to share with us what your day was like on January 6th?
Yeah. So I was not, it's interesting. I live pretty close to the Capitol, but I was not at the Capitol or covering the Capitol that day. So my daughter, who again was probably like, I don't know, 2 or 3 at the time, but with a nanny, this was during COVID, and so our nanny and her friend and a couple little kids, they actually always used to go up to the Capitol and just play on the grass outside of the Capitol. That's where they went every single day during COVID, because it wasn't a playground. It was germ free. It was a big open space. They were outdoors, and we sort of, our nanny too, right? Like living in DC or living in Baltimore, but obviously following the news in DC, we sort of all kind of, as things progressed, we all just sort of decided that that was no longer a good area for the kids to play in. So there was like a little sense of foreshadowing that you shouldn't have like 3 2.5-year-olds there in the weeks leading up to it. So they hadn't been going there. And this was in the height of COVID. So I was working from home. I think my husband was working from home. My older daughter was like homeschooling from home. We were running like an in-home daycare center from home. So like everyone's in the house, and I just remember kind of watching it. I mean, it was happening just blocks away, but I like the rest of America, I just watched it all unfold on TV. And I was just so shocked. I mean, whatever, I was shocked throughout, but I had covered Congress, and Congress is just so strict with decorum, like the speaker's lobby. I don't know why this was the thing that stuck out in my mind, but the speaker's lobby, when I covered Congress, is this area, it's very ornate. And if you're a reporter covering Congress, you can go in there. It's just off the floor of the House chamber. And you can try to kind of get House members to come out and talk to you and interview them there for votes. It's like a good place to try to grab members. But to go in, very strict. Women can't be wearing like bare shoulders. If you have bare shoulders, they ask you to leave. Men have to have ties. I feel like one day I was like, technically, I would argue, dressed appropriately, but the combination of my corduroys, my cowboy boots, and my sweater was somehow like inappropriate in the collective, and I was asked to leave. So anyhow, it's just like to move around the Capitol, there's all of these rules of where you can't, and I just remember being stunned to see the Capitol like overrun in this way, right? And I remember when Ashley Babbitt was shot, you're watching on live TV, and she's trying to like break into the speaker's lobby, and I was just thinking like I couldn't go in there in cowboy boots, right? And now people like, I was just sort of like, it's weird the things you remember, but that it just felt like the entire like Capitol and Congress as I understood it had been upended. And then of course I had colleagues and friends who covered Congress, and I was thinking about them, but I was also not bothering them because I figured they had like bigger things to deal with.
Actually, I have one more question. What happened with the Supreme Court? I believe it's mobilized, or hopefully will mobilize women in this nation, and that will have a big effect on the congressional election. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I think we'll see in November. That's certainly what Democrats think and hope. That's and Republicans are treading more carefully on the issue, because when it was all a hypothetical, right? When everyone thought Roe v. Wade was settled law, it was very easy to either be pro-abortion rights or anti-abortion rights. But now that has been taken away, there's a lot of shades of gray, right? And so it turns out that some people who are pro-abortion rights, they may be pro-abortion rights, but they wouldn't personally get an abortion. They may be pro-abortion rights, but they feel squeamish of people choosing to have abortions because they don't like after 20 weeks or for certain medical conditions, right? And then there's other people who, would have said it proudly pro-life, but when they think about it, they say, well, wait a minute, if, this happened to my teenage daughter, I feel differently, or, rape, incest, health of mother, I believe, right? Like everyone has a different line. It's an incredibly personal issue, and that seems to be why it has been so galvanizing. And obviously, the vote in Kansas surprised a ton of people and would argue that it's galvanizing for women, for pro-abortion rights women, and a benefit to Democrats. But it's also much different to vote for an issue, as they got to do in Kansas, than to vote for a candidate, right? Who's a person and may be imperfect in other ways and may share your view on abortion, but the thing you're really voting for has to do with charter schools because you have 2 kids and that's the most important issue, or gas prices. So, I mean, it is seismic. The polling has shown that. Democrats believe that. But I think, does it flip the House back to Democrats? Probably. I don't think Democrats win the House. And how seismic, I think we kind of have to wait and see.
One more question. Can I
Sure.
ask a silly question?
Sure.
And it bothers me when reporters are talking about the abortion issue, and they say people who are pregnant instead of women who are. Why do they do that? Everybody gets pregnant if they didn't.
You give a good answer to this, you're coming back.
Why do they do that?
I think I'm probably not going to be the best person to answer this question, but I think the reason people say that is because they're trying to be very inclusive to a community that could include, I guess would be trans men who are biologically capable of carrying children. But you are correct that the majority of people who are pregnant are biologically women. I think that's right. But I think it's inclusivity.
Thank you so much. I think, don't you all feel like insiders now? We know, we've heard from the inside valuable information that makes us better citizens. Let's hope that. So I'm going to see you 1 week from today, right back here. And thank you so much for being here.